Paddy Pimblett may be the most fraudulent UFC title contender of all time. Let's get into it. Dana White recently announced on his Instagram Live, breathing down his phone,
"I want to oil you up." What the fuck does that mean?
$7 billion Paramount deal, by the way. But Paddy Pimblett is fighting Justin Gaethje in January for the interim lightweight belt. Why does it feel like this is the route the UFC is going to go? It feels like since the whole Tom Aspinall and John Jones situation, they can get a lot more super fights out of just making an interim belt. Because the initial plan, even before Arman Tsarukyan fought Dan Hooker, was that Paddy Pimblett would be fighting Ilia Topuria in January for the lightweight title. So now this works out perfectly for the UFC. They get another big fight with Paddy Pimblett, and then he's eventually going to get smudged out by Ilia. I also just want to kick this off by saying this is not a hate video on Paddy Pimblett whatsoever. I think he's extremely talented. This is just me being honest and critical of the UFC's matchmaking and the clear Dana White privilege that is applied to specific fighters.
I'm gonna be real. You got this attitude. You got Dana White privilege.
This first theme I want to talk about is the manufactured rise. Paddy Pimblett has had the most artificially protected matchmaking in UFC lightweight history. And maybe in the UFC in general. I would even argue that Sean O'Malley fought tougher opponents before fighting for a title. Let's look at the facts, man. He does not have a single win over an active top 10 contender. I also went back and looked at his most recent fights and look at the ages of his opponents. Bobby Green, 38 years old. Michael Chandler, 38 years old. And now Justin Gaethje, 37 years old. Now, do I think that Justin Gaethje deserves to be fighting for an interim title either? Absolutely not. If we're following logical sense and rankings, it should be Arman Tsarukyan versus Max Holloway. But I can completely understand the UFC not wanting to match up Max Holloway for an interim title, especially since he's carrying the BMF title. When you look at business sense, the UFC can get 2 title fights, well now 3 because of the interim belt, but they can also get another title fight with Max Holloway carrying the BMF belt, so why would they put him for an interim belt? But look at Paddy Pimblett's UFC career, right? Because he has genuine star potential, the fans get behind him, he's got an entire country backing him. The UFC intentionally avoided giving Paddy Pimblett any unfavorable matchups. He somehow got to a title fight by avoiding the genuine killers in the top 5 of the division. The UFC avoided matching him up with Max Holloway, Dustin Poirier, Arman Tsarukyan, Charles Oliveira. These are all names, when you think of the top of the lightweight division, that's who you think of. I think the UFC gave him the easiest layup for an interim title fight. Justin Gaethje's 37 years old, has taken an immense amount of damage throughout his career. Granted, he's still very dangerous. I'm not writing him off from this fight, even though I think he loses. But out of all those names I just listed, he's definitely the easiest fight for Paddy Pimblett. Earlier this year, Ilia Topuria literally warned the UFC about not letting Paddy Pimblett cross Arman Tsarukyan if they wanted to get him to a title fight.
So if he wants to assure his title shot, he has to fight with Justin Gaethje, because if he fights with Arman, I think that Arman's gonna beat him. So the easiest path he has right now to get the title shot is Justin.
And this UFC 324 lineup just proves that point. It feels like they really listened to Ilia Topuria. Maybe Ilia is the secret matchmaker, man. Anyway, the next thing I want to talk about is this Justin Gaethje fight makes zero sporting sense. This UFC 324 card is absolutely stacked. These are amazing fights that I personally am very excited to watch. Even the Paddy versus Justin Gaethje fight is a fight that I was saying should happen. I was saying this like 6 months ago, but it should have never been for an interim title. They honestly should have made the Max Holloway versus Charles Oliveira BMF title fight the headliner for this event, and then put the Paddy versus Justin fight somewhere else on this card as just a regular co-main #1 contender fight. This interim title fight is only happening because Ilia Topuria is going to be inactive for the first half of 2026. But the weird part here is that Arman just fought for a #1 contender fight, which Dana White himself confirmed.
Dana, earlier this week, you scheduled Arman Tsarukyan to fight Dan Hooker in November.
Yeah.
And will the winner of that fight become the #1 contender in the lightweight division?
Will the number of that? Yeah.
So the real question here is, why is Paddy getting to jump the line? It's funny because Dana White himself said that Dana White privilege isn't real.
Dana White privilege, you don't become #2 in the world without earning it. So, and I don't pick that. There is no such thing as Dana White privilege in this company.
Obviously, they don't have any control of how the actual fight plays out, but matchmaking leverage absolutely is. You can control who gets matched up with who at what point in their career. Take this interim title fight, right? Paddy is getting Justin Gaethje at the perfect time. And like I said, Paddy Pimblett was able to completely avoid the actual death row of lightweight. The next thing I want to talk about is why Paddy Pimblett is the safest choice. Paddy Pimblett for the UFC is is the least dangerous option commercially, because let's just look at the facts. He has a huge fan base, has a relatively exciting style, gets a lot of finishes, is a pretty decent trash talker.
Whatever, you sausage.
And also, unlike Justin Gaethje and a lot of these top lightweights, aren't nearing retirement anytime soon. The UFC knows that Justin Gaethje isn't a long-term champion. That's why they chose to match him up with a much younger guy that most likely is going to beat him. Because they know realistically, if Justin Gaethje wins the belt, he's most likely going to retire that night or fight one more time. The goal for every UFC fighter is to retire at the top, never to win the belt and then go on a crazy downfall. The UFC needs fresh stars at lightweight, and Paddy Pimblett is the perfect investment. I think oftentimes MMA fans underestimate how much the UFC is aware of the risk versus reward matrix when they make these matchups. A lot of fans think that the UFC just don't know what they're doing and they're clueless matchmakers, but trust me, every matchup they do has a deeper plan behind it. This next theme I want to talk about is how the Arman situation exposes the flawed system. Sidelining Arman and not giving him what he deserves is either a complete marketing genius move from the UFC or just obviously showing their bias. Because if you look at it from one angle, right, the marketing genius angle, you could easily say the UFC did this on purpose so that the fan base would get behind Arman massively, and that way when he does fight for a title, he'll have an even bigger fan base, because us as MMA fans love to root for an underdog who is being overlooked. Because you look at the facts, right, Arman deserves the next title fight, no question about it. He passed that Dan Hooker test with absolute ease, which again was claimed to be a #1 contender fight. And let's just call it what it is, man. Arman Tsarukyan is the most dangerous contender in the lightweight division, an absolute nightmare matchup for anyone, including Ilia Topuria. And the UFC knew if they made Paddy versus Arman for the interim title, Arman Tsarukyan would absolutely derail the hype train of Paddy Pimblett. And then you've just essentially lost the biggest star in the division and also one of the biggest fights you can currently make in Ilia versus Paddy. Ilia versus Arman is the real competitive fight to make, but Paddy versus Ilia is just simply easier to sell. Like I said, none of this is Paddy's fault whatsoever. Like, if you're being offered an interim title fight, you're not going to say no. But we've also just got to call it how it is, man. This next thing I want to talk about is the UFC's leverage game. I mentioned this in my most recent video, but the UFC gives multiple fighters title fight offers at once so that they have the leverage to negotiate down their pay. If a fighter is guaranteed fighting for the title, they can almost always negotiate a higher pay for that fight. But if the UFC can go to Paddy and say, well, we've got Justin Gaethje, Arman Tsarukyan, who we can also offer a title fight to, Paddy Pimblett is more likely to just agree with whatever the UFC offers because he doesn't want to lose that title opportunity. We see this in every division. The UFC always tries their best to avoid having a clear-cut #1 contender, because then the leverage is in the fighter's hands. It's a very smart play by the UFC, because even though they want to promote their stars, they also at the same time don't want to give them too much power, because then they turn into a Conor McGregor character type. The next theme I want to talk about is the age factor and the timeline manipulation. Arman Tsarukyan said something very interesting yesterday in an interview where he basically gave his reaction to this whole situation.
And I think this is UFC game plan. It's not like family issue or something. Is they want to make star Paddy Pimblett and to fight for the title with Topuria as a bigger name and make it like a big fight.
So by the sounds of it, Arman Tsarukyan kind of believes this conspiracy that the UFC knew this would be the matchup all along. I mostly agree with him. I do genuinely believe that the UFC were planning Ilia Topuria versus Paddy Pimblett for the January card, but I think even before UFC Qatar, where Arman fought Dan Hooker, the UFC knew that Ilia Topuria wasn't going to be ready for January, but they kept this silent. And Ilia Topuria probably agreed to keep it silent because then you sideline the genuine biggest threat to your title reign. Look, the UFC knew that Ilia Topuria wouldn't be ready for January, and Arman himself was under the impression that Ilia Topuria would be fighting Paddy Pimblett in January, so that his fight with Dan Hooker was genuinely a #1 contender for the winner of that January fight. The UFC played this perfectly. They knew they had to make an interim title fight, but chose not to say anything to Arman or announce it to the fans because there would have been genuine public outrage. Because this means that Arman Tsarukyan isn't next for the undisputed title. Whoever wins in January against Paddy and Justin is going to have to fight Ilia in June, which means Arman Tsarukyan at the very earliest could get his title shot at the end of 2026. And just imagine if Ilia Topuria somehow loses to Paddy, then they're going to do a rematch of Ilia versus Paddy, and then Arman, well, I don't know, he's probably just going to retire at that point, man. And to be honest, we've known for a while the UFC doesn't follow genuine merit when it comes to making these fights. As much as the UFC tries to pose themselves as a legitimate, the best fight's the best type of sport, that's just not what happens anymore. It's just whoever has the most leverage and also who draws in the biggest numbers, which, don't hate the the player, man, hate the game. The last 3 matchups of Paddy Pimblett definitely don't warrant him getting a title fight. Like, look, he fought Tony Ferguson, coming off a 6-fight skid, and then Bobby Green on the tail end of his career, and then Michael Chandler, a guy that was extremely inactive and has fought like twice in 4 years. But to be fair, the UFC fans want this Paddy storyline. It's purely emotional, not logical. Paddy Pimblett has been doubted his entire career, but now he's finally fighting for the title. And people often confuse popularity with deservingness. The UFC knows this and absolutely leans into it. It's a smart choice. If we look at what a genuine title path for Paddy Pimblett should have looked like, after he fought Michael Chandler and was ranked in the top 10, he then should have fought either Charles Oliveira or Justin Gaethje, and then now be fighting for a #1 contender against Arman Tsarukyan. That for me would have been a way more legitimate path, and honestly would have made me way more interested in this Paddy versus Ilia fight. The fact that Paddy versus Ilia was genuinely the original plan for January blows my mind. Imagine the outrage if that got announced. This last thing I want to talk about is why this matters. This sets a very dangerous precedent for merit in not only this division, but for the entire UFC roster. We are seeing this a lot more now. People like Kamaru Usman, Justin Gaethje can sit out and claim a title shot because they quote unquote have done enough and also have a big fan base. Which on one hand I can agree from their perspective, but now we have guys like Paddy Pimblett who haven't really done anything in the sport but have a lot of hype, and the UFC will leverage that to just boost them to a title shot. This just takes the spotlight away from genuine contenders that maybe don't know how to promote themselves. And honestly, it's making this division look like the WWE at times. If Paddy Pimblett wins here, he becomes the least proven title contender of all time. But if Paddy Pimblett loses here, the UFC loses their golden goose. This fight honestly should have been Paddy versus Arman, because no matter who would win this fight, they would either get Paddy Pimblett, who has a lot of hype fighting for the title next, or they would get Arman Tsarukyan, a guy that maybe doesn't have as much hype, but is a genuine title contender fighting for the belt. That's honestly best of both worlds. I don't know why the UFC didn't go this route. But yeah, man, those are my overall thoughts on this situation. Let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with me? Make sure you guys do drop a like on this video and make sure to subscribe as well, man. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.